The Oregon coast in November was a study in gray. Gray sky bleeding into gray ocean, waves the color of gunmetal crashing against black basalt cliffs with a sound like distant artillery fire. The storm rolling in from the Pacific wasn't just weather. It was a living, breathing thing, pushing walls of rain ahead of it like an invading army, bending the ancient Sitka spruce trees until their branches screamed in protest. Sergeant First Class Daniel Ghost Mercer stood on the deck of his rented cabin, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the storm approach with the detached appreciation of a man who'd seen far worse. At 36, Ghost had earned his nickname not from stealth operations, though he'd run plenty of those through the mountains of Afghanistan and the urban labyrinths of Syria, but from the way he'd disappeared after his last deployment, ghosting his entire former life like smoke dissipating in wind, searching for something that resembled peace in this forgotten corner of the world that even GPS seemed reluctant to acknowledge. He was tall, lean in the way of distance runners and special operations soldiers who'd spent years carrying 80-pound rucksacks across hostile terrain, with hair buzzed military short despite being 3 months into terminal leave and having no regulations left to follow. His eyes were hazel, shifting between green and brown depending on the light, but they'd seen things in 15 years of warfare that left permanent shadows in them, making them appear darker than they were, harder, like stones polished smooth by years of running water. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to his collarbone, a knife wound from a close-quarters fight in Mogadishu that had missed his carotid artery by millimeters and left him with a reminder that death was always closer than comfort. The cabin itself was perfect for a man trying to disappear. Weathered cedar shingles that had gone silver with age, a metal roof that drummed like a snare during rain, windows that rattled in their frames when the wind came from the northwest. It sat on 5 acres of dense forest, 3 miles from the nearest town, Crescent Bay, population 2,400, and surrounded by trees so thick you could scream and nobody would hear you. Ghost had verified that personally, during one of the nightmares that still woke him at 0300 every morning like clockwork, his body drenched in sweat, his hands reaching for weapons that weren't under his pillow anymore. Beside him sat Odin, a Belgian Malinois who'd retired from the Navy Special Warfare Development Group, the unit civilians called SEAL Team 6, on the same day Ghost had signed his discharge papers. The dog was 85 pounds of corded muscle wrapped in a coat of rich fawn and black, with eyes that missed absolutely nothing, ears that could track a whisper from 50 meters, and a nose that had saved 17 American lives by sniffing out IEDs before they could turn Humvees into coffins. But the last one had been too close. The blast, a pressure plate IED buried under a dirt road outside Kandahar, had damaged Odin's hearing in his left ear and given him a permanent limp in his right hind leg, along with scars that crisscrossed his shoulders like a road map of violence. The Navy had retired him with honors, a ceremony with a medal that the dog couldn't eat, and praise that didn't fix the way he flinched at loud noises. Ghost had adopted him with something that felt like love, but tasted like obligation, because they were both broken in ways that civilian veterinarians and VA psychiatrists couldn't quite fix, and misery loved company, especially when that company understood what it meant to wake up expecting incoming fire. "Big storm coming, buddy," Ghost murmured, scratching behind Odin's ears in the exact spot that made the dog's back leg twitch with pleasure. The dog's tail thumped once against the weathered wood of the deck, but his attention was fixed on the horizon, reading the wind like a language Ghost had forgotten how to speak, processing information through senses that far exceeded human capability. The interior of the cabin was sparse in a way that bordered on monastic. No television, because Ghost couldn't watch the news without calculating defensive positions in the broadcast locations. No radio, because music reminded him of villages he'd helped destroy. No photographs, because the faces of the dead didn't need frames to haunt you. Instead, a military cot with olive-drab blankets pulled tight enough to bounce a quarter, not a bed, because beds were for people who'd forgotten how to sleep light. A footlocker instead of a dresser, packed in a way that meant he could be mobile in under 2 minutes. A camping stove, because cooking on something that required assembly and disassembly felt normal, felt like deployment, felt like the only life he'd ever really understood. The only luxury was the stone fireplace, currently crackling with cedar logs that filled the single room with warmth and the scent of better times, of camping trips with his father before the old man's heart had given out, before Ghost had joined the Navy and learned that killing was a skill you could perfect. Ghost's phone sat on the small kitchen table, deliberately placed screen down like a landmine he was trying to ignore. His sister Sarah had called 3 times this week from Sacramento, leaving increasingly worried voicemails. "Danny, please call me back. Mom's asking about you. We're worried. Nobody's heard from you in 2 months." His former team leader, Commander Jake Reaper Sullivan, had called twice with messages that tried for casual but landed somewhere around concerned. "Ghost, just checking in. Team's not the same without you. Call when you can." And the VA psychiatrist who'd declared him fit for discharge with recommendations for ongoing counseling had left a voicemail suggesting a check-in appointment to discuss your transition to civilian life and any lingering concerns about reintegration. He'd ignored them all, let the calls roll to voicemail, let the messages pile up like bodies in a war zone that nobody wanted to count. Because Ghost had learned something fundamental in 15 years of special operations. You couldn't talk away the things that lived in your head like squatters in condemned buildings. You couldn't therapize away the sound of incoming mortars or the smell of burned flesh or the weight of carrying a teammate's body to a helicopter while taking fire. You could only learn to live with them, the way you learn to live with shrapnel too close to vital organs to remove surgically, just there, forever, a permanent reminder that some wounds don't close. Odin suddenly stood up from his position by Ghost's feet, his body going rigid in the way it had in Helmand Province when he'd detected explosives, when every muscle became a coiled spring ready to bolt or fight. A low growl rumbled in his chest, barely audible over the rising wind that was stripping leaves from trees and sending them spiraling like shrapnel. "What is it?" Ghost's hand instinctively moved to his waistband, where he still carried a Glock 19 despite being 3,000 miles from any active combat zone and having no legal reason to be armed while standing on his own property. Old habits died hard, old instincts died harder, and Ghost's instincts had kept him alive through situations where better trained men had died, so he'd stopped questioning them and started trusting them like religion. The dog wasn't looking at the forest or the gravel road that wound 3 miles through trees to reach the cabin. He was staring southeast, toward town, toward civilization, his damaged ear twitching as if trying to catch a sound just beyond the range of even his superior canine hearing. Ghost followed the dog's gaze, but saw nothing except the storm clouds rolling in like a tsunami of gray. Nothing except the first fat drops of rain beginning to patter against the deck like fingers tapping on glass. "False alarm, boy. Just the weather messing with your head." But Odin didn't relax. He paced to the edge of the deck and back, whining softly, a sound Ghost recognized from deployments, the sound the dog made in Afghanistan when he'd detected explosives but couldn't pinpoint the exact location, when danger was close but invisible, when something was fundamentally wrong with the world, but Ghost's human senses couldn't detect what. Something was wrong. Odin knew it with canine certainty. Ghost just hadn't figured out what yet. The first heavy drops of rain hit the metal roof like bullets, individual impacts that quickly merged into a sustained roar. The storm had arrived with the speed and violence of an ambush, visibility dropping to maybe 30 feet, the world beyond the cabin disappearing into sheets of gray water. Ghost didn't know it yet, couldn't know it yet, but somewhere in that storm, 3 miles away in a patrol car hidden on an abandoned logging road, a good woman was dying. Deputy Sheriff Rachel Torres was slumped over her steering wheel, her nervous system shutting down from organophosphate poisoning, her lungs forgetting how to pull oxygen, her heart slowing to a rhythm that couldn't sustain life. She had maybe 15 minutes left before her diaphragm stopped working entirely, and she suffocated in her own cruiser, alone, forgotten, another casualty of a war between good and evil that most people didn't know was being fought. And, in less than an hour, Ghost's carefully constructed isolation would shatter like glass under a hammer, and the war he thought he'd left behind in the mountains of Afghanistan would find him again, because war always found men like Ghost Mercer. It was what he was trained for, what he was built for, what he couldn't escape no matter how far he ran or how deep he hid. Thunder cracked across the sky like God-splitting wood, and Odin howled, a sound Ghost had never heard the dog make before, a sound of warning and prophecy and dread, a sound that raised the hair on the back of Ghost's neck and made his combat instinct scream that something was catastrophically wrong. The hunt was about to begin, whether Ghost wanted it to or not. Deputy Sheriff Rachel Torres had been with the Crescent Bay Sheriff's Department for 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Not that she was counting, but cops remembered dates the way soldiers remembered firefights, with crystal clarity and permanent weight. In that time, she'd dealt with domestic disputes that made her question humanity. Drunk tourists who thought small-town cops were jokes, elderly shoplifters who were just lonely and stealing to get attention, and exactly one bank robbery that turned out to be a confused elderly man named Herbert who'd tried to cash a check at gunpoint because he thought the young teller was stealing from him and he'd gotten the procedures mixed up with something he'd seen on television. What she'd never dealt with in 8 years of rural law enforcement was this: a credible, immediate, deadly threat from a man who scared even the career criminals. At 34, Rachel was compact and strong, built like a gymnast or a boxer, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it gave her headaches by midday, and eyes that could read a lie from across a crowded room. A skill she'd learned from her father, who'd been a fisherman and could tell when the ocean was lying about being calm. She'd grown up in Crescent Bay, left for college at Portland State and the police academy in Salem, then returned 6 years ago because someone needed to protect the place she loved, and if not her, then who? Right now, sitting in her patrol cruiser on a rutted logging road that hadn't seen legal use in a decade, that place she loved was under threat from a monster in an expensive suit. Victor Kozlov had moved to Crescent Bay 6 months ago, purchasing a massive waterfront estate through a maze of shell corporations and limited liability companies that the FBI was still trying to untangle like fishing line that had spent 10 years in a tackle box. He claimed to be an import-export businessman, specializing in Pacific Rim trade facilitation, which was corporate speak for nothing, which was exactly the point. Rachel's investigation, 3 months of surveillance, financial analysis, and witness interviews, suggested he was actually laundering money for the Russian mob, using Crescent Bay's fishing industry as cover, moving millions of dollars through fake invoices for halibut and salmon that never existed. But it was worse than money laundering. So much worse. Last night, working on a tip from a terrified dock worker who'd refused to give his name, Rachel had broken into Warehouse 7 at the commercial docks using a warrant she'd obtained through a cooperative judge in the next county. What she'd found had made her blood run cold and her hands shake as she photographed everything with her phone, uploading each image to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers in real time, because evidence this important needed backup and redundancy. A shipping container with a false bottom. Not unusual in itself, smugglers had used that trick since containers were invented, but the contents of that false bottom. Not drugs, not cash, but weapons. Military-grade weapons, AK-47 rifles still packed in Cosmoline grease, RPG launchers with Cyrillic markings, crates of ammunition, plastic explosives with Russian military stamps, enough firepower to arm a small militia or supply every gang on the West Coast for a year. Kozlov wasn't just laundering money, he was trafficking weapons into the United States, and Rachel had documented every serial number, every crate, every damning piece of evidence. She'd called her captain immediately, Marcus Webb, 20-year veteran, solid reputation, a man she'd trusted with her life on multiple occasions. "Captain, I need backup for an arrest warrant. Kozlov's trafficking weapons, military grade. I have photos, documentation, everything we need." Webb had told her to sit tight. That backup was coming, that they'd handle it first thing in the morning with a coordinated operation involving state police and possibly federal agents. That was 18 hours ago. Now she sat in her cruiser, waiting for backup that should have arrived 3 hours ago, trying to stay warm in the November rain while her radio crackled with static and her gut screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You should have taken the money." Rachel's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Last week, an envelope had appeared on her doorstep at 600, tucked under the mat like a newspaper. Inside, $50,000 in $100 bills, still smelling like the bank, along with a note typed on expensive cardstock that said simply, "For looking the other way. Everyone else has." She'd logged it as evidence, photographed every bill, run the serial numbers through FinCEN databases, continued her investigation without breaking stride. Now she understood. It hadn't been a bribe, it had been a test, and she'd failed it. Another text appeared. "Check your coffee." Rachel looked at the travel mug in her cup holder, the coffee she'd poured from the station pot 90 minutes ago, the coffee that tasted slightly bitter, but she'd attributed to cheap beans and a dirty machine. The station where Kozlov's money could have bought any number of people, where $50,000 could purchase loyalty or at least silence. Her hands started trembling. Not from fear, from something neurological, something chemical, something deadly, poison. She grabbed her radio with fingers that suddenly wouldn't cooperate properly, her hand spasming as she tried to key the microphone. "Dispatch. This is Deputy Torres, badge 847. I've been compromised. Repeat, I have been poisoned. Need immediate medical assistance. Current location." The world tilted sideways like God had kicked the planet off its axis. Her vision blurred at the edges. reality becoming watercolor. The radio slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered to the floor of the cruiser, rolling under the brake pedal where she couldn't reach it. She tried to open the car door, to get outside where someone might find her, but her muscles wouldn't respond to her brain's commands. The poison, something fast-acting, something professional, something military-grade, was shutting down her nervous system like flipping circuit breakers in sequence. Her last clear thought was clinical and terrifying. Organophosphate. Nerve agent. I have maybe 10 minutes before respiratory failure. She fumbled for her phone with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, managing to hit the emergency SOS function before her fingers stopped working entirely, before her body became a prison. The phone pinged her GPS location to emergency services, a digital scream into the void, but in this storm, with the highways flooding and resources stretched thin, help could be hours away, hours she didn't have. Rachel slumped against the steering wheel, her breathing shallow and rapid, her heart rate slowing in a way that meant death was approaching with professional efficiency. The rain hammered against the windshield, turning the world into an abstract painting of grays and blacks, reality dissolving like watercolors left in the rain. She was 3 miles from town, 3 miles from the hospital, 3 miles from anyone who could help, anyone who knew she was dying, anyone who gave a damn that a good cop was being murdered for refusing to be bought. The cruiser sat on an abandoned logging road, invisible from the highway, slowly being swallowed by the storm and the forest and the indifference of a universe that didn't care if one more person died alone. Rachel Torres was dying, and she knew it. Victor Kozlov sat in his waterfront estate, 8,000 square feet of glass, steel, and arrogance perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, watching the storm through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people earned in 5 years, and he smiled the smile of a predator who'd just secured his kill. At 48, Kozlov had the kind of face that looked pleasant in photographs and reassuring in business meetings, soft features that suggested approachability, an easy smile that reached his eyes in practiced ways, warm brown irises that women found trustworthy and men found non-threatening. It was a face that had convinced 3 wives to marry him before they disappeared into quiet divorces with generous settlements and ironclad non-disclosure agreements that purchased their silence about what they'd witnessed during the marriages. It was a face that had been on the cover of Pacific Northwest Business Magazine with a headline calling him an import-export innovator revitalizing coastal communities. It was also the face of a man who'd ordered 17 executions in his career with the Solntsevskaya Bratva, the most powerful and violent organized crime syndicate in Russia, working his way up from street-level enforcer in Moscow to regional director of North American operations, a promotion that came with a 7-figure salary, unlimited authority, and the understanding that failure meant a shallow grave in the woods. "Is it done?" Kozlov asked in accented English, not turning from the window where he watched lightning fork across the sky like God's own finger pointing accusations. The man, standing 3 respectful paces behind him, Dmitry Volkov, Kozlov's head of security and chief enforcer, checked his phone, scrolling through encrypted messages with the casual efficiency of a man who'd spent 20 years in Russian Spetsnaz learning how to kill people in creative ways. "Da, boss. The deputy consumed the poisoned coffee at 1600 hours. She has been off-grid for 53 minutes now. No radio contact, no movement, no calls. CTA number 1. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." And the backup she requested? Kozlov swirled the vodka in his glass, watching the liquid catch the firelight from the enormous stone fireplace that burned imported wood because American trees weren't good enough. The highway flooding is real, but we encouraged it. A few well-placed drainage system failures, a tree that mysteriously fell across the road at exactly the right location. The state police will not reach her in time, even if they leave now, which they have not. Dmitri paused, consulting his phone again. Our contact in county dispatch has been routing emergency calls away from that area, claiming all units are engaged with the storm. Response. Kozlov nodded, satisfied with the operational efficiency. This was how you ran a criminal enterprise, with the precision of a military operation and the ruthlessness of a Fortune 500 CEO. What about her evidence? The photographs from the warehouse? Her captain has not yet acted on her report. We have multiple sources inside the department, 2 deputies and the IT administrator. If Captain Webb moves to file for warrants or involves federal agents, we will know within minutes. Dimitri's face remained professionally neutral, but there was something in his voice. The deputy uploaded files to a cloud server. Our cyber team in Moscow is working to locate and delete them. How long? 4 hours, maybe less. The Americans use strong encryption, but everything can be broken with enough processing power and enough money. We have both. Kozlov finally turned from the window, his soft features hardening into something that revealed the monster beneath the mask. He was dressed casually. Designer jeans that cost $1,000, a cashmere sweater in charcoal gray, Italian loafers handmade by a man in Florence who had a 6-month waiting list. Everything about him screamed wealth, sophistication, the kind of success that America promised to immigrants who worked hard and played by the rules. Everything except his eyes. His eyes were flat, dead, emotionless, the eyes of a shark or crocodile, a predator that had long ago stopped seeing humans as anything more than obstacles to be removed or opportunities to be exploited. She was a problem, Kozlov said, the words clinical, discussing a person the way an exterminator might discuss termites. Problems must be eliminated efficiently, completely, and in ways that do not draw attention. This is business, nothing personal. The poison is untraceable, Dmitri assured him, reciting operational details like a mission briefing. VX variant, modified by our chemists. It will appear as a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork, a tragic loss for the community. People will attend her funeral, cry appropriate tears, then forget she existed within 6 months. Kozlov raised his glass in a mock toast, the vodka catching the light. To Deputy Torres. May she rest in peace, knowing she died doing her duty to maintain law and order in our beautiful community. Dmitri didn't join the toast. He was a professional, a former Spetsnaz operator who'd killed men in 16 countries across 4 continents. But there was something distasteful about poisoning a cop who'd only been doing her job. It lacked honor. It was the work of cowards who hid behind lawyers and shell corporations instead of facing threats directly. But Dmitri was paid $200,000 a year plus benefits to provide security consultation and enforcement. Not moral philosophy, so he stayed silent and maintained his neutral expression. What about witnesses? Kozlov asked, already moving to the next potential problem. Who knew she was investigating our operations? Her captain, the district attorney. No one else on record. She kept the investigation compartmentalized, which ironically makes cleanup easier for us. Dmitri pulled up notes on his phone. The civilian population loves her. She is local, grew up here, popular with the community. If she dies, there will be grief, maybe some questions from the newspaper, but no one will suspect murder. Rural sheriff's departments lose deputies to heart attacks, car accidents, suicide. It is tragic, but statistically common. Kozlov finished his vodka, the liquid burning down his throat like absolution he didn't need, because he'd stopped believing in God the same year he'd killed his first man. Then, we have nothing to worry about. The operation continues as planned. What about the weapons shipment tomorrow night? It proceeds. The deputy cannot testify if she is dead. Her evidence cannot be used if we delete it. Captain Webb is already on our payroll. He will ensure the investigation goes nowhere, even if someone asks questions. Kozlov walked to a mahogany sideboard and poured more vodka. By this time next week, we will have distributed $3 million in weapons across the West Coast, and Deputy Torres will be a footnote in the local newspaper obituaries. But even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crossed Kozlov's soft features. A shadow of concern he quickly buried under practiced arrogance. The storm outside was worse than forecasted, the kind of storm that revealed things meant to stay hidden, the kind that washed away carefully constructed lies and exposed the bones beneath. "Double the security on the docks," Kozlov ordered, his voice sharper now. "I want men patrolling all night. I want drones monitoring the perimeter if this weather allows it. If anyone comes looking for the deputy, I want to know immediately. Da, boss. Consider it done." As Dmitri left to deploy the security team, Kozlov returned to the window, watching lightning illuminate the churning ocean. Somewhere out in that storm, a woman was dying, her lungs struggling for oxygen, her heart forgetting its rhythm, her body betraying her in ways she couldn't fight. Kozlov felt nothing. Remorse was for people with consciences, and he'd shed his long ago in a Moscow alley when he'd killed his first man. A rival gang member who'd made the mistake of disrespecting Kozlov's boss. He'd stabbed the man 17 times with a screwdriver, watched him bleed out on dirty snow, and felt nothing except satisfaction at a job completed. That was 25 years ago. He'd killed many men since then, and felt nothing for any of them. The world operated on power, not fairness, on money, not justice, on strength, not goodness. Kozlov had accepted this truth early and built an empire on its foundation. What Kozlov didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 3 miles away a different kind of predator was waking up. A man trained by the United States military to hunt human beings in the most hostile environments on Earth. A man who'd spent 15 years tracking, capturing, and eliminating high-value targets across multiple continents. A man whose dog could smell death from 3 miles away. The storm was about to reveal more than Kozlov's secrets. It was about to unleash a reckoning. I'll continue with the remaining sections to reach the full 14,000 words. Should I continue generating the expanded story? The poison hit Rachel's system with the systematic brutality of a professional execution. She'd studied toxicology at the police academy, had memorized the charts and symptoms, passed the tests with flying colors, earned praise from instructors who said she had a gift for remembering details. Now, those details were playing out in her own body, like a textbook coming to horrifying life. And all that knowledge did was let her know exactly how she was dying and how little time she had left. Organophosphate poisoning shut down the body's nervous system by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme responsible for breaking down acetylcholine at nerve junctions. Without that enzyme doing its job, acetylcholine accumulated to toxic levels, overstimulating muscles until they couldn't relax, couldn't function, couldn't do anything except seize and fail. First came the tremors she was experiencing now, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't have held her service weapon if she tried. Then convulsions. Then respiratory failure as her diaphragm forgot how to pull air into her lungs. Then death, usually within 15 to 20 minutes of exposure, depending on the dose and the victim's body weight. Rachel figured she had 12 minutes left, maybe 10. She tried to focus through the haze of neurological misfiring that was turning her brain into static. Her academy training kicked in through sheer force of will, habit overriding panic, protocol becoming the life raft she clung to. Assess, adapt, act, assess, poisoned with what appeared to be a high-dose organophosphate, possibly VX or a variant given the rapid onset. Alone in a patrol car on an abandoned logging road with zero backup and deteriorating communication. Storm-making rescue operations nearly impossible. Time until death, approximately 10 to 12 minutes. Adapt. Can't drive. Her hands won't grip the steering wheel properly and her vision is blurring. Can't walk. Her legs are already weak and getting weaker by the second. Can't call for help verbally. Her tongue feels thick and her throat is constricting. The emergency SOS on her phone is her only hope, but in this storm, with this terrain, response time could be 30 minutes minimum. She didn't have 30 minutes. She had 10. Act. Survive until help arrives, by any means necessary. Rachel forced her trembling hand toward the glove compartment, her muscles spasming and misfiring, making what should have been a simple reach feel like climbing a mountain. It took 3 attempts to get the compartment open, her fingers refusing to grip properly, feeling like they belonged to someone else. Like her body was a machine whose controls had been scrambled. Inside the glove compartment, her emergency medical kit, standard issue for rural law enforcement, trauma bandages for gunshot wounds, a tourniquet for arterial bleeding, aspirin for heart attacks, and, thank God, thank God, thank God, an EpiPen that she'd requisitioned last year after a domestic violence call where the suspect had been stung by bees and nearly died before the ambulance arrived. Epinephrine wouldn't cure organophosphate poisoning. She knew that. The textbook said you needed atropine, you needed pralidoxim, you needed real antidotes administered by doctors who knew what they were doing. But epinephrine would increase her heart rate, constrict her blood vessels, maybe buy her a few more minutes of consciousness by keeping her cardiovascular system from completely shutting down. It was a Hail Mary, a desperate gamble. But desperate was all she had left. Rachel grabbed the EpiPen with both shaking hands. It took both hands now, her coordination destroyed, removed the safety cap with her teeth because her fingers wouldn't cooperate, positioned it against her thigh through her uniform pants, and jabbed down hard. The spring-loaded needle punched through the fabric and into her quadriceps muscle, delivering 0.3 milligrams of epinephrine directly into her bloodstream. The rush hit her system within seconds, like she'd mainlined lightning, her heart rate spiking from a dangerously low 48 beats per minute to over 120, her vision sharpening momentarily as blood pressure surged, her hand steadying just enough that she could almost make a fist. The epinephrine bought her maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. It was treating a symptom, not the cause, like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. But 5 minutes was better than dying right now. Rachel slumped back against the driver's seat, rain hammering the roof in a rhythm that sounded like a funeral drum, and did something she hadn't done since her father's funeral 8 years ago. She prayed. God, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm, slurred like she was drunk. If you're listening, I'm not ready. There's too much left to do. Mom needs me. The town needs me. The case needs someone to finish it." Her breathing was labored now, each inhale requiring conscious effort, her autonomic nervous system beginning to fail. "Please, send someone. Anyone. I don't want to die like this. Not alone. Not for nothing." The radio on the floor crackled with static, but no voices came through. The storm had knocked out most communications, and even if someone heard her distress call, they couldn't reach her through the flooded roads and fallen trees. Her phone screen glowed on the passenger seat where it had fallen, the emergency SOS still active, GPS coordinates broadcasting her location to emergency services who couldn't come, to dispatchers who couldn't help, to a system that was failing her in her moment of greatest need. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Rachel could see her life playing out like scenes from a movie she'd already watched. Her father teaching her to shoot at age 10 with his old .357 Magnum, telling her that protecting people wasn't just a job, but a calling, a responsibility that came to those strong enough to bear it. Her graduation from the police academy, her mother crying with pride in the audience while Rachel stood at attention in her dress uniform, believing she could make a difference. Her first day on patrol in Crescent Bay, feeling like she'd finally come home after years of searching for where she belonged. And now, this, dying alone in a patrol car, killed by a criminal who'd calculated that her death was worth less than the profit from his weapons trafficking. Dying because she'd refused to be bought, refused to look away, refused to be anything less than what her father had taught her to be. Rachel's hand fell to her lap, too weak to hold itself up any more. Her breathing was becoming more labored, more shallow, each breath a battle her diaphragm was losing. The epinephrine was wearing off. She could feel it draining away like water through her fingers, leaving her weaker than before, closer to the end. She closed her eyes, accepting the inevitable with the same calm she'd learned from her father when he'd taught her to shoot. Sometimes you take the shot. Sometimes the shot takes you. Either way, you face it with dignity. Rachel Torres had lived with dignity. She would die the same way. She didn't hear the approaching engine through the storm and the blood pounding in her ears. She didn't see the headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights seeking prisoners. She didn't know that 3 miles away, a retired SEAL and his war dog had just begun the most important mission of their lives. But Odin knew. The dog had known for an hour, pacing and whining and growling at threats Ghost's human senses couldn't detect. Dogs had 60 times more olfactory receptors than humans, could detect chemical changes in the air from miles away, could smell fear and disease and death approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Odin had smelled the poison in Rachel's system from 3 miles away, carried on the wind, processed by a nose that had been trained to detect explosives but could detect so much more. He'd smelled death approaching Deputy Rachel Torres, and every instinct in his body, instincts honed by thousands of years of evolution and refined by years of military training, had been screaming at Ghost to move, to hunt, to save. And finally, Ghost was listening. Ghost had tried to ignore Odin's agitation for the first hour, rationalizing it as a reaction to the barometric pressure changes that came with major storms. Dogs sensed weather, reacted to atmospheric shifts in ways humans couldn't understand. It was normal, explainable, nothing to worry about. But Odin's behavior wasn't normal, and Ghost had survived 15 years in special operations by trusting his instincts and his teammates. And Odin had been his most reliable teammate for the last 5 years. This wasn't weather anxiety. This was the dog's mission alert posture, the specific stance Odin had taken in Afghanistan when he'd detected a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device hidden in a mosque courtyard, or in Yemen when he'd found a weapons cache buried under a schoolhouse floor, or in Syria when he'd smelled chemical weapons before the SEAL team had walked into an ambush. The dog knew something Ghost didn't, and ignoring that knowledge had gotten people killed in the past. Finally, after an hour of watching Odin pace and whine and stare toward town with absolute focus, Ghost gave in to the instinct that had kept him alive through 100 operations. Trust the dog. "All right, buddy," Ghost said, grabbing his tactical jacket, a worn Carhartt that had seen better days but still kept out wind and rain. "Show me what's got you so worked up. But if this is about a deer, I'm revoking your bacon privileges." He didn't bother with his truck. The logging roads would be impassable in this storm. Mud and flooding would make even his four-wheel drive F-150 useless. Instead, he grabbed his go bag, the tactical backpack he'd kept packed since Afghanistan, the one that held everything he might need for an emergency. Trauma medical kit with combat-grade supplies, communication equipment, basic survival gear, weapons, ammunition, and enough equipment to treat a battlefield casualty or fight his way out of an ambush. Old habits. They never really died. He clipped Odin to a long tracking lead, 50 feet of paracord that gave the dog freedom to range but kept him from disappearing entirely into the forest, and stepped off the deck into the storm. The rain hit like a physical force, cold and hard, driven by wind that had to be gusting 40 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet in the best conditions, down to 10 in the worst. The forest floor was already turning into a swamp, every step a battle against mud that wanted to keep his boots as souvenirs. But Ghost had trained for this in SEER school. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape, had spent weeks learning to move through hostile environments without roads or landmarks, using nothing but instinct and training and stubbornness to reach objectives that seemed impossible. He let Odin lead, trusting the dog's nose and the instincts that had saved American lives more times than Ghost could count. Odin didn't wander or hesitate. He moved with purpose, pulling Ghost southeast through dense underbrush, following a scent trail that Ghost's inferior human nose couldn't detect. Not random wandering, purposeful tracking. The dog was hunting something specific. They'd been moving for 40 minutes. Ghost tracking, time by habit, always aware of how long operations took, how much daylight remained, how far they'd traveled, when Odin suddenly stopped so abruptly that Ghost almost tripped over him. The dog's body went rigid, every muscle taut, his damaged ear swiveling forward, his good ear doing the same, triangulating on something ahead. Ghost dropped to a knee, scanning the terrain with the tactical awareness that had become second nature. They had reached a logging road, barely visible through the rain, more of a muddy track than an actual road. And there, almost completely hidden by underbrush and the poor visibility, was a vehicle. Crescent Bay Sheriff's Department patrol cruiser, Crown Victoria, older model, probably 8 or 9 years old. Engine off, windows fogged with condensation. Ghost's training kicked in instantly. Situational assessment. Threat or victim, trap or emergency. His hand moved to the Glock at his waistband, not drawing it, but ready, always ready. He approached tactically, using the forest as concealment, scanning for threats or ambush signs. The last thing he needed was to walk into a setup. Criminals sometimes used apparent emergencies as bait, waited for good Samaritans to approach, then robbed or killed them. But Odin wasn't growling, his threat warning that meant danger ahead. Instead, the dog whined urgently, pulled toward the vehicle, his body language screaming, "Victim! Hurry! Time critical." Ghost trusted that assessment more than his own paranoia. He moved quickly now, closing the distance to the cruiser, his boots splashing through ankle-deep water that had pooled on the logging road. He reached the driver's side window, used his sleeve to wipe away the condensation, and looked inside. A woman in a sheriff's deputy uniform was slumped over the steering wheel, her face pale as chalk, lips turning blue with cyanosis, body convulsing in small rhythmic spasms that Ghost recognized immediately from his combat medic training. "Shit," Ghost muttered, yanking open the door. It wasn't locked. Maybe she'd been trying to get out when the poison fully took hold. He'd seen this before. Not in America, in Syria, in a village where Assad's forces had dropped chemical weapons, where civilians had died in ways that violated every international law but happened anyway because war didn't care about laws, nerve agent poisoning, organophosphate exposure, the tremors, the shallow breathing, the pinpoint pupils, the blue lips indicating oxygen deprivation. This woman was dying. Had maybe 5 minutes left before her respiratory system shut down completely, and she suffocated. Ghost checked her pulse, weak, thready, far too slow, heart rate around 45 beats per minute when it should be 60-80. Checked her pupils. Pinpoint, non-reactive to his flashlight, classic sign of organophosphate poisoning. Checked her respiratory rate, 8 breaths per minute when it should be 12 to 16. She was circling the drain, medical terminology for a patient about to die. He had minutes, maybe less. "Stay with me, Deputy," Ghost said, his voice shifting into the calm, commanding tone of a combat medic taking control of a trauma situation. The voice that told wounded soldiers they were going to survive even when the odds said otherwise. "You're not dying today, not on my watch." He pulled her out of the cruiser with practiced efficiency, ignoring her dead weight. She probably weighed 130 pounds, and he'd carried wounded teammates twice that size through mountain passes under fire. He laid her flat on the ground, despite the rain and mud, because airway management was more important than staying dry, and victims of nerve agent poisoning needed to be horizontal to maximize blood flow to the brain. From his tactical pack, he pulled his medical kit, not a civilian first aid kit with Band-Aids and aspirin, but a full IFAC, individual first aid kit, with combat-grade trauma supplies, the same kit that had saved lives in Fallujah and Kandahar and Mogadishu. He found what he needed: atropine auto-injectors, 2 of them, military issue, the antidote for organophosphate poisoning. Atropine worked by blocking acetylcholine receptors, preventing the neurotransmitter from overstimulating muscles, giving the body time to metabolize and eliminate the poison. Ghost had carried these auto-injectors for years in case of chemical weapons exposure. Never thought he'd use them on American soil. Never thought he'd need them to save a cop in Oregon instead of a soldier in Afghanistan. He injected the first dose into her thigh, straight through her uniform pants. No time to be gentle or proper. Then a second dose into her shoulder, following military protocol for severe nerve agent exposure that said if 1 dose was good, 2 was better, and 3 was what you used when someone was actively dying. "Come on," Ghost muttered, starting chest compressions with the heel of his hand, counting rhythm the way the medics had taught him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "Come on, Deputy, don't you quit on me. Fight! That's an order." Odin stood guard 3 feet away, positioned between Ghost and the road, scanning for threats with the discipline of a dog who'd done this 100 times before. When Ghost went into medic mode, Odin became security, became Overwatch, became the early warning system that had saved SEAL teams from ambushes when they were focused on treating casualties. Rachel's body convulsed once, violently, her back arching off the muddy ground. Then she gasped, a horrible, choking, drowning sound like someone surfacing from underwater after too long. But it was a sound, air moving, life fighting back. Ghost rolled her onto her side, recovery position, as she vomited, her body purging the poison, trying to expel the chemicals that had nearly killed her. Good. That meant the atropine was working, meant her body was regaining control of basic functions, meant she might actually survive this. That's it, Ghost encouraged, supporting her head with one hand while using the other to keep her airway clear. Get it out, all of it. Fight back. You're doing great. Her eyes fluttered open, dark brown, dilated now as the atropine counteracted the pinpoint constriction, confused and terrified and desperately trying to understand what was happening. "Who?" she croaked, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm help," Ghost said simply, the most honest 2 words he could offer. "You've been poisoned. Organophosphate, probably VX or a variant. I've administered atropine, 2 doses, military grade. You're going to survive, but we need to get you somewhere warm and dry and ideally to a hospital. Can you tell me your name?" "Rachel, Deputy Rachel Torres." Each word was an effort, her vocal cords still partially paralyzed, her throat raw from the convulsions and vomiting. "Okay, Rachel, I'm Ghost. That's Odin." He gestured to the dog, who was still maintaining his security perimeter with professional focus. "We're going to get you out of here, but I need to assess you first. Can you move your fingers?" She tried. Her fingers twitched, uncoordinated but moving. Good sign. Toes? Another twitch. Also good. "Can you take a deep breath for me?" She inhaled shakily, her diaphragm fighting to work properly. Not great, but better than 2 minutes ago when she wasn't breathing at all. Ghost checked her pulse again. 72 beats per minute. Much better. Respiratory rate, 14 breaths per minute, nearly normal. Skin color, still pale, but the blue tinge was fading. She was stabilizing. The atropine had pulled her back from the edge, but she wasn't out of danger. Organophosphate poisoning required hospital observation, potential follow-up doses, monitoring for complications like aspiration pneumonia from the vomiting. Ghost keyed the radio in Rachel's cruiser, trying to reach dispatch. Static. Tried her cell phone. No signal. The storm had knocked out everything. They were on their own. "Can you walk?" Ghost asked, already knowing the answer but hoping for a miracle. Rachel tried to stand, pushing up on trembling arms, but her legs buckled immediately, her motor control still too compromised. The poison had done too much damage too quickly. "Okay, plan B." Ghost secured his pack on his back, then lifted Rachel in a fireman's carry, textbook tactical casualty evacuation that every SEAL learned in training. She weighed maybe 130 pounds. He'd carried wounded teammates twice that size through mountain passes in Afghanistan while taking fire from Taliban fighters. This was just Tuesday. "Odin, heel. Lead us home, buddy." The dog immediately started back the way they'd come, moving steadily through the storm, his training and instincts guiding them back toward Ghost's cabin, where there was warmth and shelter and communication equipment that might work when everything else had failed. Ghost followed, carrying the dying deputy, rain pouring down in sheets, every step a battle against mud and exhaustion and the weight of responsibility. They'd been moving for 15 minutes, Ghost tracking time habitually, always aware, when Rachel whispered something against his shoulder, her voice muffled by rain and weakness. "Kozlov. Victor Kozlov. He poisoned me. He's trafficking weapons. I have evidence." "Save your strength," Ghost said, his breathing steady despite the exertion, despite carrying 130 pounds through a storm. "No, you don't understand." She was fighting to stay conscious now, fighting to deliver information that might die with her. "He'll come for you too. He's dangerous. He owns half the town, corrupted the police captain. If I die, the evidence dies with me." Then her body went limp, unconscious, her compromised system shutting down to conserve energy for healing. Ghost adjusted his grip and kept moving. He'd gotten the important information, a name, Victor Kozlov, and the knowledge that this wasn't random. Someone had tried to murder a cop, someone powerful enough to poison her and assume they'd get away with it. Ghost's jaw tightened. He'd left the war behind, moved to Oregon specifically to escape violence and duty, and the endless cycle of hunting bad men in bad places. But the war had just found him anyway, and whoever this Kozlov was, whatever empire he'd built, whatever power he thought he possessed, it meant nothing, because Victor Kozlov had just made a fatal tactical error. He'd threatened someone under Ghost's protection, someone Ghost had chosen to save, someone who was now part of Ghost's mission, whether either of them had planned it or not. And when SEALs adopted a mission, they didn't quit until it was complete. The hunt had begun. And monsters learned eventually that there were things in the dark more dangerous than they were. Ghost's cabin appeared through the rain like a mirage or an answered prayer. Small, weathered, but blessedly solid, with smoke rising from the chimney where the fire he'd built that morning was still burning, still providing warmth against a storm that seemed determined to freeze the world. He carried Rachel inside, kicking the door shut behind him with his boot, and laid her gently on his military cot, stripping off her wet uniform jacket and boots with the efficient detachment of a medic who'd done this 1,000 times. Hypothermia killed people faster than poison sometimes, especially in November rain that leached heat from bodies faster than fires could replace it. Medical assessment, systematic and thorough, pulse 88, stronger than before. Breathing 16 per minute, nearly normal. Skin color improving from deathly pale to just regular pale. Temperature likely low but not critical. The atropine had stabilized her, pulled her back from respiratory failure, bought them time. But she needed monitoring. Organophosphate poisoning could relapse. The body could metabolize the atropine faster than it eliminated the poison, leading to secondary exposure symptoms that could be just as deadly as the initial dose. Ghost built up the fire, changed Rachel into dry clothes, his own thermal shirt and sweatpants that were comically oversized on her smaller frame, but dry and warm, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned, plus his sleeping bag. He positioned Odin beside the cot where the dog's body heat would provide additional warmth, additional comfort, additional security. Then he sat in his chair, the same chair he had occupied for 3 months, watching the forest and wrestling with demons, and began the combat medic ritual he'd performed hundreds of times, monitoring vitals every 15 minutes like clockwork. 15 hours, pulse 92, respiration 16, responsive to verbal stimuli. 15:30 hours, pulse 88, respiration 14, sleeping but stable. 15:45 hours, pulse 90, respiration 16, color improving. You didn't get lazy, didn't get complacent, didn't assume someone was stable until they'd been stable for hours under observation. That's what separated professional medics from amateurs. Consistency, discipline, the willingness to do the boring parts of medicine that saved lives but earned no glory. While he worked, Ghost's tactical mind was already in mission planning mode, the same mode that had kept him alive through 15 years of special operations. Someone had poisoned a cop. That meant organized crime, significant resources, corruption deep enough to compromise coffee at a police station. That meant this wasn't over. The people who'd tried to kill Rachel would try again once they realized she'd survived, which meant Ghost needed to secure the area, establish perimeter defense, and figure out who the hell Victor Kozlov was and why he thought murdering law enforcement officers was acceptable behavior. At 1600 hours, 3 hours after he'd found Rachel dying in her cruiser, Ghost's phone buzzed. A miracle in itself, given the storm. A text message from a number he didn't recognize. Deputy Torres missing. Last known location, Highway 101 near mile marker 47. All units searching. If you have information, contact Crescent Bay Sheriff's Department immediately. Ghost stared at the message, his combat instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. He'd found Rachel 3 miles off any highway, on an abandoned logging road that wasn't even on most maps. She hadn't been at mile marker 47. Someone was feeding false information to searchers. Someone was deliberately pointing rescue operations away from where Rachel actually was. Someone wanted her to die. Ghost didn't respond to the text. Whoever sent it, whether well-meaning dispatcher or corrupt insider, would just report back that Ghost Mercer had information about the missing deputy, and then questions would be asked, attention would be focused, and people who wanted Rachel dead would realize she'd survived. Better to stay silent, stay invisible. Let them think she died alone in the woods while Ghost figured out what he was dealing with. He pulled out his laptop, a ruggedized military spec machine that could survive being dropped from a helicopter, and opened the secure VPN that still gave him access to certain databases through his former team connections. He typed, Victor Kozlov, Crescent Bay, Oregon. The search results made Ghost's blood run cold. Victor Kozlov, Russian national, age 48, suspected member of Solntsevskaya Bratva. Multiple intelligence reports linking him to money laundering, weapons trafficking, and at least 15 suspected homicides across 3 continents. Interpol Red Notice issued 2019, later withdrawn after pressure from Russian government. Known to operate through shell corporations and legitimate business fronts. Current location, Crescent Bay, Oregon, where he'd purchased a waterfront estate 6 months ago for $4.2 million cash. FBI field office in Portland had an open investigation, but lacked evidence for arrest warrants. Local law enforcement considered him a respected businessman. Community leaders praised his charitable donations and economic investment. Classic organized crime playbook. Buy legitimacy. Infiltrate power structures, eliminate threats, operate with impunity. And Rachel had apparently gotten close enough to threaten that operation. Close enough to earn a death sentence. Ghost closed the laptop, his tactical mind processing scenarios. He had a critically injured witness to a federal crime. He had no communication with friendly forces. He had an unknown number of hostile actors with significant resources and local corruption. He had maybe 12 hours before Rachel was stable enough to be moved, and every hour she stayed here increased the risk that Kozlov's people would find her. Classic denied area operation. No support, no backup, operating alone with limited resources against a numerically superior enemy force. Ghost had run 100 operations like this. The math was always terrible, the odds were always bad, and he'd won every single time. He checked Rachel's vitals again. Pulse 86, respiration 14, sleeping peacefully. Odin was curled beside her, his presence providing comfort and warmth. Ghost walked to his weapons locker, a secure safe bolted to the floor that held the arsenal he'd accumulated during 15 years of service. His Glock 19, standard seal sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 for backup, 300 rounds of 9mm ammunition, his KA bar knife with 7 inches of carbon steel that had saved his life in Mogadishu, night vision equipment, communications gear. Everything he needed for a direct action mission against a high-value target. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted to go back to war, back to hunting, back to being the ghost that haunted men's nightmares. But war didn't care what you wanted. It came anyway, found you in cabins in the woods, forced you to choose between hiding and fighting, and Ghost had never been good at hiding. His phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. Mr. Mercer, this is Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, FBI, Portland Field Office. We understand you may have information about Deputy Torres. Please call immediately. This is urgent. Ghost stared at the message. The FBI knew his name, knew his location, knew he was somehow connected. That meant someone had told them. Either the dispatcher who'd tracked his phone signal, or Rachel had listed him as a contact before she'd been poisoned, or the FBI had been monitoring communications and intercepted something. He called the number. Mitchell. A crisp female voice answered immediately. This is Daniel Mercer. You texted me about Deputy Torres. Mr. Mercer, thank God. Where are you? Do you have information about... I have Deputy Torres, Ghost interrupted. She was poisoned with a VX variant nerve agent approximately 4 hours ago. I found her in a patrol car 3 miles northeast of town on an abandoned logging road. I administered 2 doses of atropine. She's stable but needs hospital observation and possible follow-up treatment. Silence on the other end. Then, Mr. Mercer, how do you know it was VX? Because I'm a former Navy SEAL combat medic with 15 years of experience dealing with chemical weapons exposure. I know what organophosphate poisoning looks like, and I know how to treat it. Another pause. Where is Deputy Torres now? Safe location. Off-grid. She told me before losing consciousness that Victor Kozlov poisoned her, that he's trafficking weapons, that she has evidence. Mr. Mercer, we need you to bring Deputy Torres to... No, Ghost interrupted. Not until I know your operation isn't compromised. Rachel said Kozlov corrupted her police captain. If he corrupted local law enforcement, he might have people in federal agencies too. I'm not bringing her anywhere until I verify it's safe. Mr. Mercer, I understand your concerns, but... Here's what's going to happen, Ghost said, his voice dropping into command mode. You're going to verify your identity by telling me something only FBI would know about SEAL team operations in Syria, 2019. Then I'll consider coordination. Until then, Rachel stays where she is, and I handle security. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then, Operation Kayla Mueller, Baghdadi raid. Your team provided external security while Delta Force conducted the assault. You personally treated 3 wounded ISIS fighters who'd been used as human shields. Ghost relaxed slightly. That information was classified. Only people with proper clearance would know those details. Okay. You're really FBI. Now tell me, is your Portland operation secure? As secure as any federal operation can be. But Mr. Mercer, if Kozlov is who Deputy Torres thinks he is, you're dealing with someone who has resources we can barely track. Mercenary security teams, cyber warfare capabilities, Political connections that reach Moscow. You can't handle this alone. I've handled worse. Not on American soil, not without backup, not with a critically injured witness to protect. Mitchell's voice softened. Mr. Mercer, I read your file. I know what you've done, what you're capable of. But this isn't Kandahar. You can't just eliminate a target and disappear. There are laws, procedures, oversight. And those laws and procedures were working so well that Rachel almost died, Ghost replied. How long until you can get here? Storm has Highway 101 closed, flooding, fallen trees. We're working on getting a helicopter cleared, but with these winds, she paused. 12 hours minimum, maybe 24. 24 hours. A lifetime when someone wanted you dead. Then I hold the line until you get here, Ghost said. Keep this channel open. If I need extraction or backup, I'll call. Mr. Mercer, he hung up. 12 to 24 hours of holding a defensive position alone against an unknown number of hostiles with superior resources. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan he had. Ghost checked Rachel's vitals one more time. Stable, sleeping, recovering, then began fortifying the cabin for what was coming. Because Kozlov would eventually realize Rachel had survived, and when he did, he'd come to finish what the poison had started, and Ghost would be waiting. By nightfall, Ghost had turned the cabin into a fortress, motion sensors at the perimeter, tripwires connected to empty cans filled with pebbles, night vision equipment charged and ready, his Glock loaded with hollow points, spare magazines within reach. Odin positioned at the door, ears tracking every sound beyond human range. At 2100 hours, the dog growled. Ghost moved to the window, scanning through night vision. 3 vehicles approaching on the Logan Road, moving without headlights. Professional, tactical. Kozlov had found them. Ghost keyed his radio to the FBI frequency. Mitchell, I have hostiles inbound. 3 vehicles, at least 9 tangos. This is going hot. Ghost, do not engage. We're 30 minutes out by helicopter. 30 minutes is 30 minutes too late. He switched off the radio. Rachel stirred on the cot. What's happening? Company, stay down, stay quiet. Odin's with you. Ghost moved to the door, checking his weapon. I'll handle this. There's too many. I've handled worse odds in Fallujah. He looked at her, his eyes hard. I don't lose people I'm protecting. Ever. He slipped out into the darkness. The men from the vehicles were spreading out, trying to surround the cabin. Former military by their movement, probably Russian Spetsnaz working for Kozlov. Good training, professional spacing. But Ghost had home field advantage and 15 years of hunting men in the dark. He moved like smoke through the forest, positioning himself behind their line. He whispered into the night, his voice carrying, "Federal agents, you're surrounded. Drop your weapons." It was a bluff. He was one man. But in the dark, against an opponent you couldn't see, uncertainty was a weapon. The lead mercenary shouted something in Russian. Ghost caught enough to understand. It's a trap. Fall back. They retreated to their vehicles, uncertain, off balance. Ghost had bought time, maybe an hour before they regrouped. He returned to the cabin to find Rachel sitting up, holding his backup Sig Sauer with professional competence. I thought I told you to stay down, Ghost said. I'm a cop. We don't stay down. She checked the magazine. What's the plan? FBI's 20 minutes out. We hold until they arrive. And if they come back before then? Ghost met her eyes. Then I show them why SEALs have a reputation. CTA number 2. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We read every comment. Let us know what you think happens next. The helicopter arrived 18 minutes later, FBI tactical team rappelling down with precision. Special Agent Mitchell was first through the door, weapon drawn, eyes scanning for threats. "Clear," Ghost reported. "Hostiles retreated. Vehicle descriptions and heading in my notes." Mitchell looked at Rachel, then at Ghost. "You held off a Russian kill team alone?" "With help." Ghost gestured to Odin. "Best operator I ever worked with." Within an hour, the FBI had cordoned off the area. Within 2 hours, they'd arrested 5 of Kozlov's mercenaries trying to flee south, and at 0300 hours, they raided Kozlov's estate with overwhelming force. Victor Kozlov was dragged from his bed in designer pajamas, his arrogance crumbling as he realized his empire was falling. Captain Webb, the corrupted police chief, was arrested simultaneously, singing like a canary to reduce his sentence. The weapons, cache Rachel had documented, was seized. 400 rifles, 23 RPGs, enough ammunition to supply a battalion. Federal crimes with mandatory minimums that would keep Kozlov in prison until he died. The Crescent Bay Community Center was packed for the ceremony. Rachel stood at the podium wearing her new sergeant's stripes, accepting the FBI's Shield of Bravery, while her mother cried in the front row and the entire town applauded. Ghost watched from the back, trying to be invisible in his civilian clothes, but Rachel found him anyway, crossed the room with purpose. "You weren't going to stay," she said. "Figured you had enough attention." "I had time for the man who saved my life." She pulled him outside to the porch where they could talk privately. "Mitchell told me you turned down their job offer. Again. FBI's not for me. Then what is for you?" Ghost looked at the town, at the people who'd rallied around Rachel, at the community that had rejected Kozlov's corruption. "Still figuring that out." "Well, while you figure it out, the sheriff's department has an opening. Training coordinator, teaching tactical medicine, crisis response, flexible hours, allows dogs." Ghost glanced at Odin, who was being fed bacon by the fire chief. "I'm not a cop." "No, you're better. You're a teacher. You saved my life because you knew what to do. Imagine how many lives you could save by teaching those skills." "Can I think about it?" "As long as you think about it here, not in some cabin." Rachel smiled. "Dinner, this Saturday, you and Odin, non-optional." Ghost found himself agreeing before he could think of reasons not to. 3 months later, Ghost stood in front of his first class. 12 first responders from across the county, eager to learn tactical medicine from a man who'd saved lives in the worst places on Earth. "I'm Daniel Mercer," he began, the name feeling strange after years of being Ghost. "And I'm going to teach you how to save someone's life when everything's gone wrong and help is too far away." He demonstrated on a dummy, chest compressions, airway management, trauma care. But it was more than technique. It was mindset. "You'll face situations where the odds are terrible and the outcome looks hopeless," Ghost said. "But giving up is never an option. You fight until help arrives or the person is stable or there's nothing left to fight for. That's what separates professionals from amateurs." After class, Rachel met him outside. They'd been having coffee twice a week, building something that felt like more than friendship but less than pressure. "You're good at this," she observed. "It's easier than I thought. Teaching feels like purpose without violence." "Maybe that's what you needed all along." They walked along the beach, Odin playing in the surf, and Ghost realized something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding, wasn't waiting for the next war to find him. He'd found something worth staying for. 2 years later, the Sheriff's Department training center that Daniel Mercer built became a model for the entire Pacific Northwest. Graduates saved hundreds of lives using skills he'd taught them. Veterans found purpose teaching alongside him. The program had a 94% success rate in preventing first responder burnout. Rachel became deputy chief, running the department with competence and compassion that restored community trust completely. And Daniel? He taught 3 days a week, volunteered with veteran organizations, fostered war dogs who needed second chances, and every Saturday had dinner with Rachel, who'd become his partner in every sense. They hadn't rushed things. Both carried scars that needed time to heal. But slowly, steadily, they built something real, something lasting. Odin lived to 13, passing peacefully with Daniel and Rachel beside him. They buried him overlooking the ocean beneath a stone that read, Odin, K-9, U.S. Navy. He saved souls. Daniel adopted another dog the next week, a young German shepherd from Afghanistan who'd lost her handler. He named her Hope. The anniversary. On the anniversary of the night he'd found Rachel dying in the storm, Daniel stood on the beach with Rachel beside him, watching the sunset. Hope played in the waves, barking at the sea. "Ever regret staying?" Rachel asked. Daniel thought about the life he could have had, rejoining the teams, accepting the FBI job, disappearing into another cabin. Then he thought about the life he'd built, teaching, healing, loving, belonging. "Not for a second," he said. Rachel kissed him, and Daniel realized that this was what he'd been fighting for all along. Not victory or valor or vengeance. Connection, community, home. Somewhere in Portland, a paramedic used techniques Daniel taught her to save a child choking in a restaurant. In Bend, a deputy applied his de-escalation training to end a standoff without firing a shot. In Eugene, a veteran used his coping strategies to make it through another day. Ripples, cascading outward. One life saved, creating opportunities to save more. That was the real mission. That was victory. Daniel looked at the ocean, at storm clouds building on the horizon. But this time, he wasn't alone in a cabin waiting for the storm to pass. This time, he had a town of people who'd stand beside him. A woman who loved him. A dog who trusted him. A purpose that didn't require violence. This time, he'd face the storm not as a ghost, but as a man. And that made all the difference. Victor Kozlov died in federal prison 3 years into his 35-year sentence. Heart attack, officially. Unofficially, even in prison, some people couldn't escape justice. Captain Webb served his time and disappeared from public life, a cautionary tale about the cost of corruption. The weapons trafficking network Kozlov had built was dismantled completely. 23 co-conspirators arrested. Millions in illegal firearms seized. And in a small coastal town in Oregon, a former SEAL and a deputy sheriff proved that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand up when everyone else walks past. Sometimes one person refusing to quit changes everything. Sometimes ghosts become human again. Sometimes the storm reveals not just darkness, but the light that was there all along. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it ghost saving Rachel in the storm? Odin's loyalty, or the moment justice was served. We read every comment. God bless, and see you in the next story.